So, did you succeed? Were you able to build this starting screen? In this video, I will show you one possible solution, and I will show you how I would build this starting screen. It all starts in this empty main.dart file, of course, and there you learned that you must add a main function, because this is kind of a special function which is automatically detected and executed by Dart when your application starts on the target device. This main function in the main.dart file is automatically detected and executed. And in this main function, you must call a special function provided by Flutter, the run app function, which then will take a widget, which then is the root widget that will be drawn onto the screen and which will then contain all the other widgets as children and as descendants to build the overall app user interface, as you learned it in the previous course section. There you also learned that run app is not available in this file out of the box. Instead, you have to import it from the Flutter framework. And you do this by adding the import keyword and then the path to the file or to the package file that you want to import. And here we indeed want to import from the Flutter package. Hence we type package::Flutter. And then here it's the material.dart file, which is the main import file when building Flutter apps. You will import most of the Flutter features from this file. So that's why we have to add it here. And with that, we unlock this run app function. Now to this function, you must pass a widget. And typically here, you start with the material app widget, which is one of the most important widgets provided by Flutter, since this will basically wrap your overall user interface and do a lot of behind the scenes setup work. So that's typically the widget with which you start. And later in this course, you will also learn about the various named arguments that you can pass to this widget constructor function, because there are a lot of things you can configure about the overall app with help of this app widget. But for the moment, we just need to set the home argument, the argument named home, this named argument, and we must set this to a widget that should be displayed inside of our app, because the material app widget itself doesn't really display anything. Instead, it just provides a shell with all that behind the scenes configuration work, as I mentioned, for the actual user interface we want to display. Well, and here inside of material app, I'd like to set the scaffold widget as my home widget. And that's another widget you saw in the previous course section already, because where material app sets up the general app shell, so to say, scaffold can be used to set up the screen that will be displayed to the user. For example, you can use scaffold to set a background color to the screen if you want to. Something we haven't done yet, but which we will do later. So that's why I'm using scaffold inside of material app to configure some settings for the actual screen that's displayed in my app. And here for scaffold at the moment, I just want to set the body argument. So an argument named body accepted by scaffold, and body, just like home, also wants a widget. So here we also must pass a widget as a value. And the widget I want to pass here will be my start screen widget. And for that, I'll build a custom widget. Now we could include this scaffold widget into that start screen custom widget as well, as I just mentioned that scaffold does some screen specific setup work. So including it into the screen widget might make a lot of sense. But since I plan on sharing the same background color and settings for all my screens in this app here, I will actually use this here as a wrapper around my different screens later. And therefore I'll put my screen specific widget combination into a separate custom widget that will then be passed as a value for this body argument to scaffold thereafter. Hence, in this project, in the lib folder, I'll add a new file, because you learned in the previous section that it's considered a good practice to put custom widgets into their own files. So that's what I'll do here. And I'll add a start_screen.dart file here. Following that naming pattern, that naming convention you learned about in the previous section, where your file names should be all lowercase, and if they happen to consist of multiple words, these words should be separated by underscores for better readability. So here it's the startScreen.dart file which I add, and in there we create a custom widget which, as you learned, is done with help of the class keyword, because we must create a class, a blueprint for an object. Because remember, Dart is an object-oriented language, all values are objects, and for more complex values like widgets or configuration objects or anything like that, you use classes as blueprints to basically tell Dart how these objects should then be created and which kind of data and logic, so functions, should belong to the object that will be created. Since these objects are all about organizing data and separating logic, so that logic that works with certain data is co-located with that data in the same object, and logic that does something else is in a different object, for example. Therefore here we build our custom start screen widget by using the class keyword, and then Start Screen sounds like a fitting widget name, though the name is up to you, but it of course should describe what this widget is all about, and it should follow this naming scheme here, where you start with an uppercase character, and if your widget name consists of multiple words, as this one here does, then every word inside of the word also starts with an uppercase character. Now, you also learned in the previous section that your widget classes must extend one of two main widget classes provided by Flutter. And that's either stateless widget or stateful widget. And here, for this starting screen, since we at the moment don't need any changing data, we can simply use stateless widget. If you chose stateful widget because we'll have a button in this widget, that's not a wrong thought, but we'll handle this button slightly differently later, which is why you can use stateless widget. Now, to unlock this stateless widget class from which we extend here, we again have to import from Flutter material to be precise. And then inside of this custom widget class, we must add a build method. That's what you have to add to your stateless widgets. The build method here must return a widget, so a value of type widget, and it should accept a context argument, which we didn't use thus far, but which we will see in action, or which we will use later in the course. We should accept it though, to make sure that we're implementing this build method correctly, because stateless widget actually wants us to implement build method, and it wants us to implement this method in a correct way. And we should therefore also add the @override annotation here to make it clear that we're in the end implementing, and as it turns out also overriding, a method expected by stateless widget. Now, in the body of this build function, this build method here, we then have to return a widget, and for the moment, to just have anything on the screen, I'll return some text using the built-in text widget, and in there I'll just say start screen like this. Now we can add const in front of this to unlock this extra performance optimization, where Dart is able to reuse certain objects, certain data structures in memory. And Visual Studio Code simply tells us that we can use const here, so that's quite convenient. We basically can't miss this opportunity. And we also have to add a constructor function here by repeating the class name. And in this constructor function, we should accept a named argument. Hence, we need curly braces here, called key. And this argument needs to be forwarded to the parent widget, to stateless widget. And as you learned in the previous section, this can easily be done by using super.key here, which is simply some Dart shortcut for saying that you want to accept an argument named key and forward it to the super class, so the parent class from which you're inheriting, and there it should also be passed to an argument named key. And stateless widget indeed will accept a named key argument. You can then also add const here in front of start screen, as you're also told by Visual Studio Code, so that you unlock this custom widget class for being used in conjunction with const, so that it could then also be reused after being created and stored in memory. And with that, I got a basic start screen widget class here. Of course, not the final version, not the solution of this task, but a start. And back in main.dart file, we can now use this as a value for body in the scaffold widget. We can use the start screen widget here. And in order to unlock this widget here, we have to import it, because in Dart, whenever you're using something, for example, a class defined in some other file, you explicitly have to import that other file. Dart will not automatically connect your files. It does not do that. So therefore here we add another import. And if you want to import from your own files, you can still do this with help of package, but now you use your project name, in my case fbasics, and then there you point at the file from which you want to import, in this case startscreen.dart. Now we can also add const here to unlock these potential performance improvements. And as you learned in the previous section, you should add a comma after every closing parentheses here, so that if you then press the format document shortcut, this code gets formatted and is a bit easier to read and understand. And with all of that, we have a very basic widget tree using a custom widget. And that's a great start. And we can now make sure that we have an emulator up and running. And with that, run this app here on that emulator and see whether we see our output here, the start screen output, on the screen. And here, that's looking good. I have start screen here. It's not centered. You can barely see it, but it's there. I have this white background from the scaffold widget. I have no error, so this is looking good. And we can therefore now continue with this solution to this first exercise.